If someone had told me a single sentence from my brother would change my life forever, I wouldn't have believed them. But that night, under the glow of chandeliers and the buzz of celebration, he said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you're better than me just because you're paying for my tuition?" And in that moment everything shifted. At the party, surrounded by laughter and clinking glasses, my brother's voice subtly cut through the air like a blade. "You think you're better than me just because you're paying for my tuition?" His words were sharp, loud, and meant to sting, and they did. Everyone fell silent, their eyes darting between us, waiting for my reaction. I stood frozen, the sacrifices I had made. Selling our family home, giving up my dreams, crashing over me like a wave. Little did he know, his cruel words that night would be the last straw, setting off a chain of decisions that would change both our lives forever. As the silence stretched on, I felt the weight of everyone's eyes, but it wasn't their judgment that pierced me, it was his. My own brother, the one I had fought so hard to support, looked at me not with gratitude but with disdain, as if I owed him everything. My hands trembled as I clenched my glass tighter, replaying all the nights I'd stayed up, balancing bills and trying to make ends meet. I sold the home our parents left us not because I wanted to, but because he needed the money to keep his dream alive. And this was my reward? Public humiliation? A bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. "Enough," I finally said, my voice steady but low. "You don't owe me gratitude, but you will no longer take my kindness for granted. Starting now, you're on your own." Gasps rippled through the room, but I didn't care. For once, I wasn't worried about appearances or about his excuses. I turned and walked out, leaving behind the weight of his entitlement, and a life that revolved around everyone but myself. It wasn't just his words that changed everything that night. It was the realization that I had been keeping us both trapped. And for the first time in years I felt free. The walk to my car felt both endless and liberating. Each step echoed with a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. For years I had convinced myself that sacrificing everything for my brother was the right thing to do. Family comes first, right? But now his words replayed in my mind, each one peeling back the layers of my denial. He didn't see my sacrifices as love or support. He saw them as a crutch, a leash holding him back. And maybe he was right. Maybe I had given too much, blinded by the hope that he'd one day realize the weight of what I'd done for him. Sitting in the car, I stared at the steering wheel, my mind racing. The house was gone. My savings were gone. And for what? A brother who stood on the shoulders of others and spat down at them? No, it was time to let go, not just of him, but of this version of myself that always put others first, no matter the cost. The next morning, I made the call to the university, informing them that I would no longer be covering his tuition. The admin lady on the other end hesitated, surprised. "Are you sure? He's only got a year left." "I'm sure," I said firmly. That year could be his to figure out. I'd done enough. It wasn't easy. He called me repeatedly, leaving furious voicemails filled with accusations and guilt trips. "You've ruined my life," he shouted in one of them. But I didn't respond. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to his needs. I started focusing on myself, my own plans, my own dreams that had been shelved for far too long. Weeks turned into months, and though the sting of his betrayal lingered, I began to feel lighter. The emptiness of our parents' absence no longer felt like something I had to fill by being everything for him. And when I passed by our old house one day, I didn't feel regret. I felt clarity. Sometimes love means letting go. And if my brother couldn't learn gratitude, he could at least learn independence. As for me, I was finally learning how to live. Months after I cut him off, life took on a new rhythm. One without the constant weight of my brother's expectations pressing on my shoulders. I found a new apartment, smaller but cozy, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself small luxuries. I joined a yoga class, started painting again, and even booked a weekend trip to the mountains. These were things I hadn't done in years, too consumed by the grind of funding someone else's dreams to even think about my own. But of course, the silence from my brother didn't last forever. One evening, as I was brushing paint onto a canvas, a hobby I'd almost forgotten I loved, my phone buzzed. It was him. The same brother who'd screamed that I was ruining his life now sounded different. His voice was quieter, hesitant, almost unsure of himself. "I just wanted to say, I get it now," he said. The words hung in the air, And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I'm sorry for what I said at the party. And for everything else. You were right to stop paying. I've been working 2 jobs to stay in school and it's hard, but I needed it. I needed to wake up. A lump formed in my throat. I had waited so long for this moment, for some recognition of what I'd done, for him to finally take responsibility. But instead of the satisfaction I thought I'd feel, there was something softer, something bittersweet. I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, but also the growth. He was finally becoming the person I had always hoped he could be. I'm glad you're figuring it out, I said simply, my tone calm but not cold. I wasn't trying to punish you, you know. I just couldn't keep losing myself to save you. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that felt heavy with understanding. I know, he finally said. And I'm going to make it right. For myself. For you. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the half-finished painting in front of me. Forgiveness is a complicated thing. It doesn't erase the pain, but it clears the path forward. My brother and I had a long way to go to rebuild what we'd lost, but for the first time in years, I felt like we were both finally moving in the right direction. The party may have broken something between us that night, but in the end it also set us free to grow, to change, and maybe, just maybe, to heal. The days that followed our conversation were unexpectedly quiet. My brother didn't bombard me with calls or demands anymore, and I didn't feel the need to check up on him. It was as if we'd both silently agreed to take the time we needed to focus on our separate lives. For me, that meant doubling down on rebuilding the version of myself I had long neglected. I signed up for an art exhibition. Nothing big, just a local community showcase. But it was the first time in years I'd dared to share something I'd created with the world. The act of putting myself out there felt vulnerable, yet exhilarating. Like stepping into the light, after hiding in the shadows for too long. My paintings were simple, inspired by emotions I'd bottled up for years. And to my surprise, people connected with them. A stranger even bought one, telling me it felt like resilience painted on canvas. I didn't tell them how fitting those words were. And then about 6 months after that night at the party, my brother surprised me again. One evening, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, there he stood, looking thinner, older, and somehow different, though the same determination I remembered from his teenage years was back in his eyes. "Hi," he said, holding out an envelope. "I wanted to give this to you." Inside was a check. Not a small one either. "I've been saving up," he explained, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "It's not everything you spent on me, but it's a start. I wanted to pay you back. You shouldn't have had to give up everything for me." I stared at the check, my throat tightening. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about him finally understanding what those sacrifices had meant. "You don't owe me this," I said, handing it back. "But I appreciate the gesture. What matters is that you're finding your way." We talked for hours that night. Not as siblings tangled in resentment or obligation, but as two adults finally seeing each other clearly. He told me about his struggles. How working through school had taught him discipline. How being independent had humbled him. And I told him about my new life, my art, and how letting go of him had allowed me to rediscover myself. In the end, the pain of that party wasn't something I wished away. It was the catalyst we both needed. It forced us to confront truths we'd been avoiding for years, and rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than unbalanced sacrifice. Today we're closer than ever, though in a healthier, more sustainable way. My brother graduated on his own, and now has a job he's proud of, and I've continued to grow as an artist, finally living a life that feels like my own. The scars from that night remain, but they're reminders of where we've been, and how far we've come. And every time I look at one of my paintings, I see not just my story, but ours. A testament to the beauty that can rise from the rubble of broken expectations. A year after that life-altering night at the party, my brother called me again, but this time it wasn't out of guilt or obligation. His voice was lighter, almost excited, and for a moment, it reminded me of the carefree boy he used to be before life complicated everything. "I'm coming to your art show," he said, a smile evident in his tone. "You don't have to." I started, but he cut me off. "No, I want to. You spent years showing up for me. Now it's my turn." The art show was my biggest yet, hosted at a gallery downtown. I'd poured my heart into the pieces on display, each one a reflection of my journey, my pain, and my healing. As I walked through the room, greeting visitors and answering questions about my work, I suddenly spotted my brother in the crowd. He was standing in front of one of my paintings, the centerpiece of the exhibit, a piece I had titled Breaking Point. The painting depicted a fractured staircase leading into a hazy, uncertain sky. Each step was cracked, barely holding together, yet the figure climbing it continued upward, determined. It was a visual representation of the moment I chose to let go of my brother's burdens and start climbing my own path. He turned when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "This one," he said softly, pointing to the painting. "It's us, isn't it?" I nodded, my chest tightening. It's what I felt that night. How it broke me, but also set me free. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. For the longest time, I thought you were just invincible. Like nothing I did could hurt you. Because you were so strong. I didn't realize how much you gave up for me. Or how much I was taking from you." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't think I've ever said it properly, but thank you. For everything. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." I blinked back, tears, realizing that this moment, the honesty, the vulnerability, was worth more than any apology or repayment could ever be. "I forgave you a long time ago," I said quietly. "But I think I needed to forgive myself too, for trying to save you at the cost of myself." We stood there together, silent but connected, as people milled around us, admiring the art. For the first time, I felt like we were no longer stuck in the past, no longer tied to the mistakes and sacrifices that had once defined our relationship. By the end of the night, my brother surprised me yet again. "I want to buy Breaking Point," he said, pulling out his wallet with a small, self-deprecating smile. "It's us, and I think it belongs with me." I laughed, shaking my head. "You don't have to buy it, I'll give it to you." But he insisted. "No, I want to. This is your work, your passion, and you deserve to be valued for it." In the end, I let him pay a symbolic price, a small fraction of what it was worth, because I knew how much it meant to him. Watching him walk away with the painting tucked under his arm, I realized something important. We weren't just repairing our relationship, we were rebuilding ourselves. Today, Breaking Point hangs in his living room, and every time I visit, I catch him glancing at it, as if it reminds him not just of the past, but of the resilience we both found in moving forward. As for me, I've continued creating art that reflects my journey, now with the support of a brother who truly understands its meaning. That night at the party may have shattered the illusions we had about each other, but it also gave us something far more valuable: the truth. And from that truth we built something stronger, something real, proof that even in the messiest moments, there's a way forward, if you're willing to climb. A few years later, life had transformed in ways I never expected. My art had gained recognition beyond the small local circles, and I was invited to showcase my work in a national exhibit. It was surreal to see my name alongside established artists, but I knew that each piece in my collection was born from years of struggle, growth, and ultimately healing. My brother, now thriving in his career and unrecognizable from the person he once was, called me the night before the exhibit's opening with a familiar mix of excitement and nervous energy. "Do you know how proud I am of you?" he said. "It's funny. All those years I thought you were sacrificing for me, but now I realize you were showing me what it meant to be brave, to create something out of nothing." His words caught me off guard, but in the best way. "It wasn't easy," I admitted, "but I think we both had to go through it to end up here. Look at us now." The exhibit's opening night was magical. The gallery buzzed with conversation, and I found myself surrounded by strangers discussing the emotions and themes behind my work. But amidst the crowd, it was my brother who stood out. He had flown in from out of town to surprise me, and when I saw him standing there in front of one of my newest pieces, tears welled in my eyes. The painting he was admiring was called Resilience. It was a companion piece to Breaking Point, showing a staircase no longer fractured but solid and steady, with sunlight pouring in from above. A figure stood at the top, no longer climbing but looking out at a vast, open horizon. "You've come full circle," he said when I approached him. This is beautiful." It's hope, isn't it? I smiled. It's us, I replied. The past, the pain, it's still there. But we've found a way to build on it. To turn it into something that holds us up instead of dragging us down. He nodded, his eyes lingering on the painting. I want to thank you again, he said after a moment, his voice soft. Not just for what you did back then, but for letting me learn the hard way. You gave me the push I needed to become this version of myself. And I hope I can be the brother you deserved all along. You already are, I said, squeezing his shoulder. As the night went on, I realized how far we'd both come. Not just in our individual journeys, but in the relationship we had rebuilt. My brother was no longer the source of my exhaustion, and I was no longer the crutch he leaned on. We had become equals, connected not by obligation, but by respect, love, and shared resilience. The painting of Breaking Point still hangs in his home, but now it's accompanied by a print of resilience. Together they tell the story of where we were and where we are now. A story of pain, forgiveness, growth, and unbreakable bonds. And every time I see those paintings, whether in his home or in my memories, I'm reminded of the truth I learned on that fateful night. Even the hardest breaking points can lead to the most beautiful transformations. Years later, I found myself standing on a stage at a conference for emerging artists, delivering a speech I never thought I'd be giving. The theme of the event was art through adversity. And as I looked out at the audience, I saw faces filled with curiosity and hope, many of them young artists who were just beginning their journeys. I took a deep breath and began. When I first started creating, I didn't realize my art would become a way to process some of the most difficult moments of my life. There was a time when I thought breaking points were the end, that they defined who you were and where you'd stop. But what I've learned is that breaking points aren't endings, they're beginnings. They're opportunities to rebuild yourself stronger, piece by piece, even when it feels impossible. As I spoke, I caught sight of my brother in the audience, sitting near the back with a quiet smile. He had come to support me, just as he had done for every milestone since that turning point in our lives. He had become my biggest cheerleader, the person who reminded me to celebrate every success, no matter how small. I want to share a story with you, I continued, about a time when I lost myself trying to hold someone else up. It took one moment, a moment of pain and clarity, for me to realize that I had to let go, not just of them, but of the version of myself that had forgotten how to dream. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But from that moment I found the strength to create something new. Not just in my art but in my life. And in the process I learned that letting go doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes it's the greatest act of love you can offer. When the talk ended, the applause was thunderous. As I stepped off the stage, my brother was waiting for me, pride radiating from him. You killed it up there, he said, pulling me into a hug. I don't know how you do it. You make even the hardest parts of life sound inspiring. Because they are, I said with a smile. We're proof of that. Later that evening we sat together in a quiet corner of the venue, looking at the program booklet where my artwork was featured prominently. I leaned back and looked at him, remembering all the years we'd struggled to get to this place of peace and understanding. You know, he said, breaking the silence, I used to think your sacrifices for me were your greatest act of love, but now I see it differently. The greatest act of love you gave me was letting me go when I needed to grow up. That's what saved me. His words hit me deeply, but instead of tears, I felt a warmth, an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey we'd both been on. And your greatest act of love, I replied, was finding your way back. Now, our lives are no longer tangled in the pain of the past. We've both grown into people we're proud to be. And our bond is stronger than ever, built not on obligation or guilt, but on mutual respect and a deep understanding of what we've been through. Every time I look at my art, I'm reminded of our story, a tale of breaking and rebuilding, of finding hope in the darkest moments, and of the unshakable bond between siblings who chose to grow, not apart but together. As the years went on, our lives continued to evolve, yet that chapter of our story always remained with us. A quiet reminder of what we had endured and how far we had come. My art continued to gain recognition, moving from galleries to larger international exhibits. I began mentoring young artists, encouraging them to channel their struggles into creativity, just as I had done. Each time I told my story, I noticed how it resonated with others, reminding me that the act of sharing was as powerful as the act of creating. One day, an email appeared in my inbox that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a publisher who had attended one of my shows. They weren't just interested in my art, they wanted my story. "We believe your journey," the email read. "From sacrifice and breaking points to resilience and transformation, is one that could inspire countless people. Would you consider writing a memoir?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. A memoir? It felt so personal, so vulnerable, to put everything on paper for the world to see. But as I sat with the idea, I thought about the people who had shared their stories with me when I needed guidance. I thought about my brother, and how we'd grown because of the truth we'd faced together. Slowly, I began to see that telling our story could be another way to honor everything we'd been through. When I called my brother to tell him about the opportunity, he surprised me by laughing. "You've always been the storyteller," he said. "You just needed the right moment to write it all down. I think it's time." And so, I began writing. The process was messy at first, reliving those difficult moments, revisiting the anger and sadness. But it was also cathartic. I realized as I wrote how much healing had already taken place, and how much of that healing had come from understanding myself and my relationship with my brother. The memoir, titled Breaking and Building, A Story of Resilience, was released 2 years later. To my astonishment, it became a bestseller. Readers from all over the world reached out to share how the story touched them, how it gave them hope during their own breaking points. What I didn't expect was how deeply it would bring my brother and me even closer. At the book launch, my brother stood in the front row, holding a copy of the book as if it were a trophy. When it was his turn to speak during the Q&A session, he stood up and said, "I don't think I'll ever stop being proud of her. What she doesn't mention enough is how much she saved me. Not by holding me up, but by showing me I could stand on my own." His words brought tears to my eyes. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just my story. It was ours, and it belonged to both of us. Now, years later, when I look at where we've ended up, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed with gratitude. My brother has built a life he's proud of, a career, a family, and a sense of purpose he once struggled to find. As for me, I found my voice not just through my art, but through the stories I've shared with the world. Together, we've proven that even the most painful breaking points can lead to unimaginable growth. In my studio, 2 paintings still hang side by side, Breaking Point and Resilience. They remind me of the journey we took together, from the darkest moments to the light that followed. Every time I see them, I remember a simple truth. Sometimes the greatest transformations come from the hardest decisions, and the bonds we rebuild after the storm are often the strongest of all. Not bound by expectations, not tied to the past, just 2 people learning how to stand on our own. And for the first time in years, I knew we'd be okay. Months passed, and for the first time in a long time, my brother and I lived separate lives. No longer bound by obligation but by choice. He worked tirelessly, balancing school and jobs. And though I knew it wasn't easy, he never once asked me for help. And I flourished. My art gained recognition. Small gallery exhibits turned into larger opportunities. For the first time, people weren't just looking at my work, they were feeling it. My paintings weren't just colors on a canvas, they were pieces of my soul, reflections of the years I spent losing and rediscovering myself. And then one evening my phone buzzed. A text from my brother. "Meet me at the old coffee shop? Got something for you." Curious, I grabbed my coat and headed out. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived, save for a few students hunched over their laptops. My brother sat at our usual table, the one we had shared years ago, back when our lives felt simpler. He looked up as I approached, a nervous smile on his face. "Hey," he said, standing up awkwardly. "Glad you came." I slid into the seat across from him. "What's up?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. I hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a check. A large one. My breath caught. "Is this?" He nodded. "The first installment of what I owe you." I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the paper. "You didn't have to." "I did," he interrupted, his voice firm. "You once told me not to pay you back out of guilt. And I'm not. I'm doing it because I can." Because I finally understand what it means to stand on my own. I studied him, searching for the boy who had once stood in that crowded party, throwing knives with his words. But he wasn't there anymore. In his place was a man who had learned, grown, and most importantly changed. I set the envelope down and leaned back, exhaling slowly. I'm proud of you, you know. He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck, but I saw the small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, I think for the first time, I'm proud of me too. We sat there for a while drinking coffee, catching up. Not as the version of us we used to be, but as the people we had become. And when we left the cafe that night, I knew this was it. The ending of one story. And the beginning of another. Epilogue, full circle. Years later, my art was displayed in a national gallery. The exhibition was called Breaking and Rebuilding. A collection of pieces that told the story of loss, sacrifice, and transformation. One painting stood at the center, Breaking Point, and right beside it, another one, Resilience. As I stood among the crowd, listening to strangers interpret my work, I felt a familiar presence beside me. Still weird seeing your art in a gallery? My brother asked, nudging me. I smirked. Still weird seeing you all grown up? He chuckled, shaking his head. Guess we both had to go through hell to get here. I looked at the paintings, the journey they represented. Yeah. But we made it, didn't we? He nodded. And for the first time in years, I realized something. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. Together. If this video hurt you, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to those who will understand.